Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt, and I'm glad to welcome you back to the Center for Security Policy to our webinar series. Remember, we do this every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. To check the specifics of upcoming topics and speakers, please go to securefreedom.org and check under the webinar tab. I'll also give you a preview of upcoming shows at the end of today's broadcast. Today's program is entitled The Growing Politicization and Weaponization of U.S. Intelligence, featuring our special guests, Bill Gertz and Ambassador Pete Hoekstra, moderated by the Center President, Fred Fleitz. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box on the GoToWebinar panel. I'll read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and on our website at securefreedom.org. And with that, I'll hand it over to the Center's President and CEO, Fred Fleitz.
Hey, Adam, thank you. And I'd like to thank all our viewers for joining us today for this important panel. After World War II, because of the horrors of the war, there was general consensus in Washington that America needed a standing peacetime intelligence service that would break the laws of other countries, steal their secrets, listen into their communications, because we live in such a dangerous world and because our nation needed this information to keep us free and safe. Our president needed this information. Now, not everyone agreed with this. There were some politicians who thought that the exercise would violate America's democratic principles and values. So they were overruled because of the experience of World War II, and particularly the belief that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a major intelligence failure. These are the abuses of our intelligence agencies over this time. Many of them came out after Watergate with the Church and Pike commissions, and those commissions came up with intelligence oversight committees to hold our intelligence agencies accountable and to make sure that they do not break the law, do not spy on American citizens. And I'm proud that one of our panelists today was a chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Now, we've seen abuses recently of our intelligence agencies that no one anticipated when they were set up after World War II and weren't talked about during the Church and Pike committees, and that is the deliberate politicization of our intelligence, our foreign intelligence agencies and capacities to target political adversaries. Now, 4 years of investigation basically has proved during the Trump years beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Obama administration abused America's foreign intelligence agencies, products, and personnel to promote their political agendas and to target political adversaries. These abuses violated the law and wasted scarce intelligence resources to target people who opposed President Obama. Now, these abuses also included spying on the Trump campaign. They included some pretty dramatic politicization of intelligence to make Obama policies look better, including skewing analysis of ISIS. Now, we're going to hear during the panel today, there also was some pretty blatant abuse of intelligence, politicization of intelligence to undermine the Trump presidency concerning China. And this is a discussion that we also have to have today. We're now looking at a new form of politicization of intelligence. Maybe it's not new, but it certainly looks like it's going to be worse. And that is the politicization of intelligence to target so-called domestic extremists. And we're now understanding that the calls to do this by Democrats and their allies is really a call on the Biden administration to use our foreign intelligence agencies to target Republicans, to target the Biden administration's political enemies. This is something we're going to talk about today. Well, to talk about these important issues, I am so proud to say we have two of our nation's most knowledgeable and respected experts on national security, and I'm proud to call both of them friends, Peter Hoekstra and Bill Gertz. Pete Hoekstra was the U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands during the Trump administration. He served 18 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 2nd District of Michigan, and he served as chairman and ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. And I'm happy to say that's where I met Pete, because I worked for him for 5 years when he was the top Republican on this committee. I'm also proud to say that Pete recently joined the Center for Security Policy as chairman of our board of advisors. Pete, welcome. I'd also like to welcome Bill Gertz. Bill Gertz is extremely well known in Washington as a national security correspondent for the Washington Times. He's worked there since 1985. He is the author of 8 books, 4 of them national bestsellers. His latest book, Deceiving the Sky Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy. And he is the author of an ebook, How China's Communist Party Made the World Sick. Bill, welcome.
Good to be here.
Well, Pete, I'd like to start with you. You recently wrote an op-ed for Fox News titled Intel Community to Target Americans. Here's what we must do to safeguard liberties. This was an awfully provocative title on what I think is a very serious threat to the privacy and security of Americans, as well as an abuse of our foreign intelligence agencies. Tell us more about this. Pete, your audio is off.
Am I back?
There you are.
All right. Hey, thank you. As you said in your opening remarks, there's been clearly politicization of the intel community at the beginning of the Trump administration and maybe throughout the Trump administration. I'm not sure exactly how long it's going to take us to find out exactly what was going on during the Trump administration. But I think there's clearly more work to be done. What really concerns me, and is why I wrote the op-ed, is that many of the same people that previously had been involved at the transition between the Biden and the Trump administrations, they're back in the administration. They're back in government, and they have their fingers back into the intel community, and we need to be very concerned and aware of what's going on in the intelligence community to make sure that it's not weaponized again. Some of the people, John Brennan, James Clapper, Mike Hayden, people that were leaders in the intelligence community, and actually people, Fred, that you and I worked with when we were on the intelligence committee. I think in many ways they crossed a line. They crossed a line that I felt uncomfortable with. They became very, very involved in the political process, which is kind of unusual for people in these types of positions. Usually they leave government and they're much more restrained and much more quiet. But these people, while they were in government and after they left, made it very, very clear who they supported and did not support in the political realm. And they crossed that line. We saw it with unmasking. We saw it in the application of FISA. We saw it with the Russian dossier. All of these types of things were misused for them to, I believe, put forward a political agenda, their political agenda. And we need to make sure that it doesn't happen. It's not appropriate. It's, there was a very, very strict wall between what the intelligence community can do internationally and what they can do domestically. Because as you said, the CIA, the intelligence community, they're rule breakers. They break the rules to gather the information that we need to keep America safe. Of course, they break these rules in countries around the world, and and they don't operate in the United States. Contrast that to the FBI, which operates primarily in the U.S., but they understand the rules and the restrictions that they as a law enforcement agency face. So we need to make that distinction very, very clear. You talked about, that when the intelligence community is, used inappropriately, it's a waste of resources. But I think the other thing that happens, it eats away at the political capital of the intelligence community. The trust that they have built up over the years with the American people, where the American people know, the intelligence community is not going to be perfect. They're not going to get everything right, but they're very, very good. But the one thing we know for sure is they don't mess around inside the United States. These individuals over the last few years, they've been eating away at that political capital and eroding it with the American people. And then the comments that have come out, you know, what triggers this op-ed? What triggers Pete Hoekstra to say, whoa, wait a minute, I don't like what I'm seeing. It was a quote from John Brennan, you know, after the new administration came in. And he starts talking about, you know, the threat that we face internally is very, very similar to the threat that we've seen overseas of extremist groups and those kinds of things. And I think beginning the argument or beginning to imply that maybe we need to use the skills and the capabilities that we've developed over years to understand and get the intent of terrorist groups outside of the United States. Maybe we need to use those capabilities against Americans. So, you know, he's beginning that discussion and that dialogue. And who's he talking about when he talks about the threats inside the United States? He's talking about people from certain religious persuasions. He's talking about, you know, authoritarians, fascists, bigots, nativists. But, you know, the interesting thing that I found is he also says, you know, libertarians. Whoa. Well, as soon as you start saying libertarians, it's not too long before you maybe are saying conservatives, Republicans, Trump supporters, or whatever. And, you know, John Brennan doesn't have a lot of credibility in this area. Remember, he's the guy that spied on the U.S. Senate. And so for him to be talking like this, you got to take it relatively seriously. The intelligence community, they have phenomenal capabilities. I think, Fred, you and I frequently would meet with different parts of the intel community, and they'd show us what their capabilities were, how they got information, and we would say, wow, you know, that's pretty good. And I'm glad they've got those capabilities. And I'm glad that they're using those capabilities against our enemies, which is exactly where they should be used. And we need to keep the intelligence committee or the intelligence community pure in that regard. Keep them focused on our external enemies. We have more than enough of them to keep them busy. They need the support of the American people, which means don't ever allow them to be used against Americans domestically or internationally, because, you know, then it becomes a very, very messy ball game. So look forward to more discussion. I look forward to hearing what my friend and colleague Bill Geertz has to say.
Thanks, Pete. Well, Bill, not to embarrass you, but I don't know any journalist who knows more about national security or China than you. And you've been following China for a long time. You've been following the intelligence community, and you've written extensively about how the intelligence community has skewed and politicized analysis of China. But you've recently been writing on an extraordinary revelation about how intelligence of China by the intelligence community was skewed for political purposes during the Trump administration. Now, this is so serious because the intelligence community exists to provide the best information to the president to make decisions, not to skew it because they don't agree with the president. So could you enlighten our audience on what you found concerning this issue?
Sure. Thanks for having me on this. As you said, this is a subject that I've been following for more than 20 years. And I point out in my book, Deceiving the Sky, that one of the incidents that prompted me to really focus on the threat of the Chinese Communist Party was in 1999, I went to the Pentagon for a briefing. At that time, Pentagon used to give reporters background briefings, and I got a briefing on the Chinese military, which was fairly vanilla. But at the end of the briefing, a colonel came in and said, "Bill, the general would like to see you." And I thought, well, this is pretty ominous. The general, it turned out, was the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And we sat down in a windowless room in the Pentagon, and this general proceeded to tell me that China was not a threat. And my journalistic response was, well, why do you believe that? And his response to me was basically because they say they're not a threat. Now, I'll grant you that he may have been trying to spin me as a reporter, but to me, giving such a dishonest answer was really a sign that the Chinese narrative that they are not a threat had reached the highest levels, not just of the US intelligence community, but the military intelligence. So here you had a nuclear armed communist dictatorship capable of wiping out American cities, and the head of the DIA was telling me they're not a threat. So that kind of really launched me. We would discover very soon after that, within a year or so, that perhaps the reason that this general told me that was because there was a spy, a Chinese spy, uncovered in the DIA. His name was Ron Monteperdo. He wasn't charged with espionage. He was charged with mishandling classified information, but the case was an espionage-related case, and he had developed contacts with close ties within the Chinese embassy, who were Chinese spies. And it turns out that this spy, Ron Monteperdo, had many proteges within the U.S. intelligence community who had an aggressive and assertive propensity to play down or ignore the threat from China, and that has continued. I would point out, let me say first that what we're talking about here in the politicization of intelligence, and I'm going to just briefly discuss this as it relates to China, we're really talking about intelligence analysis. There are many dedicated CIA people that are involved in other nefarious and dangerous activities. So really my focus is on the analytical part. And really what you have is a very strong view within this intelligence analysis community that their view must be accepted. And rather than really becoming a service to policymakers over many years, the intelligence analysis process and reporting process has become a kind of a poke your finger in the eye of the policymaker, and really it leads to a kind of the tail wagging the dog when it comes to policy. And I think we saw that very clearly during the Trump administration. You mentioned, so fast forward to January 7th, and we had the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, issue a truly remarkable report, which to me basically confirmed parts of what I have been reporting on for over 25 years, the politicization of intelligence related to China. And so Radcliffe said in his 3-page declassified statement that the politicization of China election influence reporting was the result of undue pressure being brought to bear on analysts who offered an alternative view based on the intelligence. So they claimed that they were going by intelligence, and they pressured other analysts to comport to their benign view of China as not having influenced the election as much as Russia. It really came down to a dispute over the Russians and the Chinese. But Radcliffe also made the point that this exposure of this downplaying of China intelligence, China interference in the election really raises broader questions over the overall quality of intelligence analysis. So what happened in this, and I'll give a little bit of the detail, it involved the National Intelligence Council, which is a group of analysts under the Director of National Intelligence, versus CIA analysts under, at the time, Gina Haspel. And these CIA analysts, the pro-China analysts, rejected the views of the NIC analysts, the National Intelligence Council, on China. And basically what Ratcliffe said was that CIA managers pressured analysts to withdraw support for alternative views of the PRC election meddling. And again, this was done to suppress intelligence on the Chinese role in the election. The NIC analysts basically said, well, blew the whistle on it, and that led to they have something called the Ombudsman for Politicization, which again gives you a sense of how important this issue of politicization is. That led to the Ombudsman for Intelligence doing a bigger assessment. So Radcliffe, again, for further detail, he said the intelligence community assessment of election interference, quote, gives the false impression that the National Intelligence Officer for Cyber was the only analyst who holds the minority view on China, and it was not. So that's how they suppress the views. And he said the differences on election meddling basically presented different views to policymakers, potentially leading to the false impression that Russia sought to influence the election, but China did not. And this, again, was identified as a violation of intelligence tradecraft rules. Here you have the intelligence and analytic community, which prides itself on telling truth to power, and yet they were basically violating their own rules. So Radcliffe's response was to this ombudsman for politicization. His name is Barry Zulaf, and he stated in a separate report to Congress that there were a number of examples of faulty analysis on China's efforts to influence the election and greater emphasis on Russian interference. And the bias was rooted in the analyst's animosity towards President Trump. Zulaf stated, China analysts appeared hesitant to assess Chinese actions as undue influence or interference. These analysts appeared reluctant to have their analysis on China brought forward because they tended to disagree with the administration's policies, saying in effect, I don't want our intelligence used to support these policies. By contrast, the Russian analysis prompted clear evidence of Russian meddling and were played up in reports. I also want to point out that this type of intelligence politicization was identified by a former CIA analyst named John Gentry, who is now a Georgetown adjunct professor, and he's written really two groundbreaking studies for a journal, intelligence journal, on the politicization question. And he notes that in the past, politicization took two types. One was what they called cooking the books to serve personal or organizational interests, and influencing policy decisions, and then the politicians using intelligence to twist intelligence to gain advantages in policies. We see this most often in covert action programs that Congress often tried to leak to the press in order to undermine them. But Gentry identified a new form in 2016 when Mike Morell, the former Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, penned an op-ed in the New York Times endorsing Hillary Clinton. And this set off a massive anti-Trump intelligence politicization campaign that involved the leaking of extremely sensitive information from the intelligence community, all with the purpose of undermining the president. It also involved the talking heads on cable, as we mentioned, Brennan, James Clapper, and Morell, really taking the unprecedented step of really going after using their position for political aims. The other thing that caused politicization was during the Obama administration, there was this huge emphasis on diversity and inclusion. And also after 9/11, there was a great influx of younger analysts, and many of whom came from the liberal milieu of the academic community and reflected those views. Okay, I'll end there. Let me just sum up by saying that this issue came up in the confirmation hearing of Avril Haines, who's now the DNI, and she was asked during her hearing, will the intelligence community be an honest broker charged with disseminating the truth? And here's what she said. She said, politics must end where intelligence work begins, and that, moreover, the IC's responsibility is to offer honest, high-quality analysis without concern for whether the message is likely to be well received. And so that's where we are today. I've seen no reaction from the intelligence community to this damning Radcliffe report, really exposing their intelligence bias on China.
Thank you, Bill. I'm now going to ask our panelists some questions, and at about 1:15, we're going to take questions from the audience that you can send in through this program. Pete, I want to start with you. As former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, your mandate was to hold our intelligence agencies accountable and to make sure they follow the law. And didn't spy on the American people. And we have two stories here. You talked about how there's a call to use our intelligence agencies to spy on libertarians. I mean, I would think you'd hear that on Saturday Night Live. How can that be true? And now this massive effort that Bill just talked about how intelligence analysts at the CIA who did not like President Trump skewed their analysis because they didn't want to produce analysis that would be favorable to Trump or Trump would want to read. So as someone who was in charge of overseeing our intelligence agencies, where does this leave us? Where are we going?
Well, I hope we're headed back to an intelligence community that kind of crawls under a rock. Not that that's where they belong, but with the job that they do, that's where they should be, and they should be reporting, to the oversight committees, and that's about it. But there's a couple of things that I really want to reinforce with Bill, and I think we both have the same feeling that, that with Brennan, with Clapper, with Hayden and Morrell, they set a tone, even though they may not have been, in the intelligence community anymore, but they kind of gave a sanction to people within the intelligence community that said, okay, you can become a little bit more political. It's terrible. With the positions that they took, I disagreed with their positions, but the very fact that they became so politically involved kind of sanctioned, the people that they used to lead, saying, well, maybe these guys have a point, and maybe there's some things that we can do to stop this terrible person in the White House. So I'm hoping that the new leadership in the intel community pulls back and they deliver their job and they deliver their information. The other thing that Bill talked about, we've seen the politicization of the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee with what he did with impeachment, and basically going on TV repeatedly and telling lies, information that didn't even exist, and misleading people about, well, here's what the intelligence is telling. I can't share it with you, but you got to be careful, and here's exactly what it was. And then the third one was the insiders protecting their own interest. The one recommendation, and you helped me develop this when we worked together on the Intel Committee, is there's a huge need for independent and what we called red team analysis, where you get the interpretation and the analysis as provided by the Intel professionals in the community. But at certain points in time, it's okay to bring in outside experts and say, hey, here's the point of view of the intelligence community. Give us an alternative point of view. Give us a red team analysis. And we did that one time on a satellite program, a huge, expensive satellite program. And every year we would get the update, and every year it would be 5 years before it would be launched. 5 years and an extra billion over what was planned. And finally, at that time, Porter Goss, who was chairman of the committee, said, Pete, you're chairing the subcommittee here. Find out what's going on here. And then we brought in an outside team of experts. And they looked at the program and said, and told the committee, this program's never going to work. It's way too complicated. The technology doesn't exist. It's too much of a stretch. And we ended up killing a major satellite program because finally someone told us what we believed was the truth, as an alternative to what people inside the community were, because they had bought into this program so long ago, and it had to be successful, even though it meant every year another billion and one more year on the timeline.
Okay. Bill, I want to turn to you, and I'm sure you want to comment on what Pete had to say. I was an intel analyst for 19 years. I know all too much about politicization of intelligence, of the liberal analysts in the CIA and management maintaining a company line that helps Democratic presidents and hurts Republican ones. And I've written about this. It's a real problem. We've seen it over and over again. The difference of the example that you mentioned is that they were caught. And that almost never happens. I mean, I know of instances that happen and there were complaints lodged about it. No one ever found out and nothing was done. So I'm just wondering if you could say more about what was the story that these analysts are trying to suppress in 2020 concerning China and the election. Where do you think this should have come out if it was done objectively?
Okay, I would say, first of all, I would go back to a speech that was given in October of 2019 by then Vice President Mike Pence. He gave a major China speech at the Hudson Institute. And during that speech, he said, I spoke with a senior intelligence official, and he talked about Chinese influence operations targeting the upcoming election. And he basically said, China wants a different president. So they were working effectively. And he quoted a senior intelligence official as saying, what China is doing pales in comparison to what Russia is doing pales in comparison to what China is doing. In other words, the Chinese influence operation was major. They were the only evidence they released at the time were inserts in newspapers, but I'm sure that there's much greater secret intelligence that wasn't released, because Pence gave another speech the following year and basically pulled back from stating that. He didn't say that in the other one. So between the two speeches, there was this intelligence battle where intelligence was suppressed. In other words, they were not going to allow, the intelligence analysts were not going to allow the Trump administration to repeat the massive election interference and the fact that China wanted a different president. And so we really don't have the details. We don't know. I mean, it remains to be seen. And certainly with all of the concern about election interference, why hasn't there been a congressional inquiry that published results of election interference by both China and Russia? And I think now that we've had the fact through Radcliffe that they skewed the intelligence on election interference, what are they going to do about it? Why not release a major report saying, here's what they said, here's what they were doing? That remains to be seen. It remains to be seen if the Biden administration will do that. I will point out that the things are not looking good, although the Biden administration is talking tough on China. I would point out that the climate czar, former Secretary of State John Kerry, has made a public statement that nothing is going to get in the way of U.S.-China climate change matters. Therefore, you can anticipate some suppression of intelligence on China in the Biden administration, unless we get some needed reform.
Pete, I want to jump back to this extraordinary statement by John Brennan that intelligence agencies should be used to target so-called domestic extremists, which include libertarians. And I mean, I just like to think this through. If the Biden administration decided to do that, what are we talking about? I mean, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, social media. I mean, this is just an extraordinary threat to our privacy and security. And it is such an unbelievable abuse of our foreign intelligence capabilities. What are we looking at here?
Well, you've got a couple things. Remember, John Brennan did not say it explicitly. Reading between the lines is what I believe he implied. From his experience, we know he has done it. When he had this tiff with Senator Feinstein, getting some information out of the intelligence community, and then he turned the CIA onto the Senate committee. It was amazing to me that he got away with it. There was a slap on the wrist, but not much more. And from my perspective, that's not a slap of the wrist offense. Spying on the people who are doing the oversight, that should have been termination from the post of CIA. But to your bigger question, it unleashes the power of the CIA, and I'm sure that many of the capabilities that the CIA has or the intel community has, those are also shared by our law enforcement folks. But our law enforcement folks know when they can and when they cannot use them, what steps they have to go through the legal process to actually be able to use those against American citizens for law enforcement and those types of things. But the CIA, or the intelligence community, doesn't operate that way. They don't have the procedures in place. They don't have the legal framework in place to check all of those things. What you do is you unleash this whole capability without any type of a framework for how they are going to, investigate, review, control, American citizens. That is the thing that I am afraid of, is that they will gather this information in ways that are not legal. They will share it in ways that are totally inappropriate. Most likely, since the direction will come from the political leaders, they will share this information with the political leaders. And it's kind of like people say, Pete, that can't happen. It's like, wait a minute, go back to 2016, early 2017, where there are discussions supposedly in the Oval Office with the President of the United States talking about transcripts of people who are unmasked. It can happen, and that is why it is so important. And maybe you need to go back and rebuild the wall and strengthen the wall between the intel community and its capabilities to share or work with domestic law enforcement. We cannot have that line crossed over. There is just way too many bad things that can happen.
Bill, I want to get you to comment on the abuse of intelligence to target domestic extremists, including the likelihood that analysis by intelligence agencies is going to be refocused, repurposed to look at Americans, to look at enemies, political enemies of the Biden administration. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. This is a major issue. For years after the 9/11 attacks and the intelligence failures related to that, the CIA failed to tip off the FBI that the hijackers had been in the country, and there was opposition at the time by the commission to creating a domestic intelligence agency. It was always said, let's let the FBI have the job. And of course, the FBI has always been hamstrung by its law enforcement versus intelligence capabilities, and they've always fallen down on the side of law enforcement. They don't do intelligence very well. And I think that's really a problem. When it comes to the Pentagon, the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin just called for a quote stand down of all military personnel to look for quote extremists within the military. The problem is there's no clear definition of extremism. I mean, this hasn't been defined, and therefore it's opening it up to a very strong politicization. So unless we come to some terms, unless we have a debate on what is this extremism, how is it identified, what groups fall within the category of violent extremists, it's going to be, again, the politicization will be acted out in ways that will be used for political ends rather than national security ends. I think that's really the problem.
Yeah, and if I could just add into that, what Austin has been doing or talking about doing, you really start taking a look at thought police. And we know what, from what Brennan's comments were, if you're espousing conservative or libertarian beliefs or those kinds of things, you could or maybe you should be considered potentially an extremist. That is a scary thought.
And I would make the point too that in the current perilous cancel culture and woke culture that we're facing, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, that the Marxists, leftists, and radicals are going to use the so-called threat of domestic extremism to go after conservatives, those who are not extremists, those who do not share the political beliefs of the radical left. So I think it's truly a very perilous time.
And people say, now it's happening on campuses, right? If you have espoused certain views, you are not welcome on many campuses around the country. And so it moves from one part of society to another. The people who have said, anybody associated with the Trump administration. We're going to follow them and make sure that they can't find employment. We're going to make sure that we intimidate organizations that might consider hiring somebody from the Trump administration, and we're going to intimidate them to make sure that they don't.
Peter, I want to talk with you a little bit about politicization of intelligence before we invite audience questions. I remember we were in a hearing one time when DNI Clapper referred to the Muslim Brotherhood as a social welfare organization, would not call it a terrorist group, would not admit that it committed acts of terrorism. I just wonder if you could talk briefly about your experience with slanted and politicized intelligence and what your concerns are right now.
Well, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood is a great example. We know what they stand for. We know what they've done internationally and those kinds of things. We saw it in the early years of the Biden administration, embracing the Muslim Brotherhood, embracing the Arab Spring, leading to the overthrow of a president in Egypt, leading to the overthrow of Gaddafi. And people will say again, "Oh, those are maybe good things." And it's like, okay, 6, 7 years, 10 years later, exactly how did these things play out? You need to identify these folks for the threat that they are. If you do not deal with them as the threat that they are, Clapper coming out and saying, "Yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood, a social welfare organization." No, they're not. They're brutal killers, and the track record and the intelligence exists out there to prove it. What happens is when you get flawed or slanted intelligence, you start making serious foreign policy mistakes. And I'm hoping that I'm actually working on writing some materials on this. Let's make sure we don't. Let's make sure we do lessons learned and that we don't make the same mistakes that we made from 2009 to 2016, whether it was in Egypt, whether it was in Libya, whether it was Libya leading to the rise of ISIS and a caliphate that literally was almost the size was it of Pennsylvania, where the geography that they called, and that was primarily because we read the tea leaves wrong, whether it was intentionally or unintentionally. And I think in many ways we did it intentionally.
Yeah, Fred, let me add something on Clapper. We've talked about Brennan, who was ideologically leftist, involved in politicization during his tenure. But just to say how dishonest Jim Clapper is, he published a book called Facts and Fears. And in that book, he falsely accused me of reporting on a supposedly off-the-record meeting with reporters that quoted him. When I went online and found that the transcript of that was public, it was part of a group called the Defense Writers Group. And I approached both his publishers and himself to ask him to correct the record in his book. Never got a response. So that kind of gives you a sense of the kind of dishonest leader he was as an intelligence, as the DNI.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, I'm now going to call on Adam Savitt, who's running this show, and invite him to put forward any questions we've gotten.
Sure, we have lots of questions, so I'm going to try to combine some here. So there's a couple on the Hunter Biden laptop. So first of all, why did FBI Director Wray sit on the hard drive from mid-2019 on? And then also the aspect of the media covering it up even after it had been reported. Whoever would like.
I'll take that one on. The Hunter Biden laptop, again, was suppressed by big tech. We saw that they broke the story in the New York Post, and social media platforms refused to run the story, claiming that it was false, and yet it was not false. By the way, the owner of the computer repair shop, which provided the laptop, is now suing Twitter for falsely claiming that he hacked the computer. I think it's a reflection of the cancel culture that's accelerating now among the elites, the ruling class, the big tech, and powerful people, that they don't want to hear the other side of the story. But that was clearly a significant story that was suppressed for political reasons during the election campaign.
Yeah, I mean, you get the politicization of intelligence, which is what we're talking about today. But this is a case where you see the politicization of technology and the media, where they're unwilling to report the story and they have double standards.
We also had a couple questions on the Swalwell Chinese spy issue.
All right.
What can be done to prevent this in the future, or hold these people to account, which it seems he's not being held to account?
Well,
Go ahead, Bill.
I covered the Swalwell case. Clearly, he was compromised by a Chinese agent, and this occurred during the Obama administration. And the FBI mishandled the case to the point where, by tipping off Swalwell to the compromise of this agent Fang Fang, who was a Chinese intelligence operative connected to the consulate in San Francisco, they tipped her off so that she could flee the country and they couldn't question her. To me, the most outrageous thing is that the Democratic leadership, including Pelosi, are continuing to allow him to be on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence as a member. I think it reflects the complete lack of understanding of the nature of foreign intelligence threats.
We had, when I was chairman of the committee, we had a member of the committee that we believed might have been compromised. We actually did a bipartisan investigation of that member and reported the results publicly. And you're not seeing any of that going on in this Congress with Swalwell. You know, it's kind of like, no problem. You can stay on the committee and let's move forward. Forget about it.
Isn't the origin of the intel abuses related to the Iran deal fight? Many of the Americans who were spied upon were pro-Israel figures who were talking to Israelis opposed to the JCPOA. Any comment?
I can't talk as to whether that is where it came from.
There were some strong, there were some newspaper reports, particularly in the Wall Street Journal, that this was true in 2014 and 2015. I think the Obama administration did spy on Americans who opposed the nuclear deal and tried to find out what they were discussing with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And as I said, there's pretty good Wall Street Journal reporting that this took place, and there were no consequences.
Yeah, and Fred and I, again, went through this process when there were reforms in FISA and those types of things. And we were, I remember meeting with the NSA and, you know, saying the strict provisions that they had put in place to make sure that American identities and American content of intercepted communications with foreigners would be protected. And I think that whole system fell apart during the Obama administration. And this was something that Devin Nunes really wanted to go after. And it was amazing to me that he was trying to get this information. But even the NSA director under Donald Trump refused to give Devin Nunes the information that he was seeking. It's kind of unprecedented, excuse me. Devin Nunes and the Intelligence Committee, they are the overseers, and the intelligence community thought they could get away with not providing the information or selectively deciding what they would and would not provide to the oversight committees. I mean, absolutely outrageous.
You know, I want to comment on that. I think there were real abuses in the last year of the Trump administration. The president ordered certain documents to be released, and the intelligence community refused to do so. And the president has ultimate classification, declassification authority. If he wants something released, it has to be released. There's a lot of blame to go around here. It wasn't just career intelligence people. It was political appointees that the president named who did not do what they should have done. I mean, I think they were talked out of doing the right thing by intelligence community attorneys, but they answered to the president. And my view was they should have either resigned or did what the president asked. And I think this is something I hope you know, great journalists like yourself, Bill, will look into and get to the bottom of what happened with this stuff.
Maybe this is too much of a can of worms, but if you wish to address any view on why Durham sat on his butt and revealed nothing before the election?
Yeah, I have a view on that. I think that this was a reflection of the new Justice Department restrictions that were imposed after James Comey screwed up the investigations during the 2016 election. As a result of that, they imposed a rule that said you are not allowed to say anything that could possibly influence the election. And I think that that was the reason that Durham was either prohibited or self-censored in not concluding his investigation. We're still waiting to see the results of that investigation, which hasn't come out yet.
The CIA, specifically Brennan, has leveraged foreign intel and governments to target Americans, for example, in Trump's orbit, UK, Italy, and Australia, bypassing US law. The CIA has also leveraged its relationship with foreign intel to target Americans who, for example, act as whistleblowers. Is there any recourse from Congress or other agencies for this?
Well, there's always recourse from Congress possible if they have the will and the diligence to actually follow through. But like I said, I think the clearest example to me was, and I think I spoke about this publicly when Brennan targeted the Senate Intel Committee. One of our foreign intelligence agencies targeting the U.S. Senate, and it's a slap on the wrist, because at that time it was under, it's under Brennan, under a Democrat president. My take on it was Feinstein should have demanded the resignation of John Brennan. There's nothing worse that I can imagine as the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee or the ranking member, but knowing that the possibility existed that the people over at the CIA thought that they could come in indiscriminately and take a look and access your computers and access your files and those kinds of things. I mean, it's like, where does that come from? So sure, Congress has they've got tremendous tools. The thing right now is that too often they're working in concert with the community rather than overseeing them and protecting and defining what the role of the intelligence community is and make sure that they stay within their lanes. And the second is when they get outside of their lanes, to hold them accountable and actually make sure that that there are consequences to their behavior.
There's a question: Do we need to create another church committee, which 1975 Senate Oversight Committee on Intelligence Agencies?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There may be enough material out there over the last 4, 5, 6 years that says yes, there is a need, and you could actually put it under the auspices of the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004, where we created some gaps in the wall between foreign intelligence and domestic law enforcement. We opened it up a little. We allowed for that. You could do it under the auspices that says, it's now been 16 years, 17 years since the passage of the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004, which much of what that bill was based on was the findings of the 9/11 Commission. And that really was the first reform of the intelligence community since it had been created after World War II. And I think you could probably make a pretty good argument. It's time to come back and take a look at how that Reform Act of 2004 is working, which created the DNI. I know Fred has strong positions and views on what needs to happen with the DNI. But did the DNI fulfill its role and mission as envisioned by the authors of that bill? It could also then take a look at the politicization, but it could take a look at the gaps that were created in the wall between foreign intelligence. I think, there could be an independent committee to review the success or the failures of the 2004 Intelligence Reform Bill?
And my comment would be, I think that there is an urgent need for fundamental structural reform within the intelligence community. The American taxpayers are not getting their money's worth for what's going on. We've seen intelligence failure after intelligence failure. The most recent one on China beginning in 2010, when literally the entire recruited agent network of the CIA was rolled up in China. And the agency doesn't even know whether it was as a result of a communications breach or one of the many moles, including Jerry Lee, who was a former CIA officer who compromised the names of agents. But there doesn't seem to be any limit to the reform. And part of the problem is the intelligence bureaucracy. I think next to the State Department bureaucracy, the most entrenched bureaucracies in government, the second most entrenched bureaucracy is the intelligence bureaucracy that has resisted and refused urgently needed reform for decades.
You know, I don't think that I want Congress reforming intelligence again. The Pike and Church committees did something I think was useful, creating the standing oversight committees, but they were incredibly partisan. The Pike Commission report was so bad, Congress wouldn't release it. It was then released because it was leaked to the Village Voice. Frank Church abused that committee to run for president. Fortunately, Ronald Reagan beat him. He was grandstanding. That would happen again if there's another congressional. And look, intelligence is even more politicized today than it used to be. But Bill is right. We need major reform of the intelligence community. I think it has gone off the rails, but it needs to be done by the next Republican president. I trust Pete Hoekstra, but I don't trust most of Congress. I certainly don't trust Adam Schiff or Mark Warner. I don't want them within 100 miles of reforming our intelligence community. Yeah. But if Donald Trump is reelected, or if we have another good Republican president in 4 years, I think they know there's a problem, and I want to see the next Republican president do this.
Yeah, the real challenge I think that Fred puts out there, which is legitimate, is how do you actually structure some people to take a look at the intelligence community and do it in an objective manner. I mean, what's happened with the Intelligence Committee in the House is unbelievable. The chairman of the Intelligence Committee leading an impeachment effort. Where does that come from? This is the Judiciary Committee. This is not the Intelligence Committee. What an abuse of the role of that committee and putting it in that type of a position, and then expecting the leadership of that committee, which is so partisan, to actually lead an effort to fundamentally restructure. That doesn't have my support. I agree. I totally agree with Fred, and I totally agree with Bill Geertz that there needs to be fundamental reform to put the intel community back in the box where it belongs.
Well, Pete Hoekstra and Bill Geertz, thank you so much for a very illuminating discussion of what I think are some very serious abuses of our foreign intelligence agencies and efforts to target Americans. We'll be writing up this panel and posting it on the website later today. I'd like to thank all of our viewers from joining us, and I'm going to let my colleague Adam Savitt close.
Sure. So our upcoming programs, remember, they're always on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Next week, March 10th, we have a book release, Qatar's Shadow War, How the Tiny Gulf State Built an Outsized Influence in American Politics, with author Dave Reboy and moderated by our Kyle Scheidler. Next week, March 17th, a program on the Uyghur genocide with Sasha Gong and a guest from the Uyghur community to be announced, hosted by the Center's Michael Waller. And March 24th, Veterans in the Fight, Keeping the Lights On in Texas, with Michael Mabey and Tom Popick, hosted by the Center's Tommy Waller. Remember, the Center's important work is only possible because of your generous support. If you do feel enriched by these webinars, please click on the red donate button on the Center's website for information on how to contribute or to make an instant contribution by credit card. Thanks to our audience and to our guests, and we'll see you here next Wednesday at 1 p.m.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.